A recent article in the Los Angeles Times put a spotlight on the protests in Portland, highlighting that our city has become a hub for the Black Lives Matter demonstrations.
Yeah, it raised questions as to why a predominantly white, urban, West Coast city, only about 6% of people here are black. So why Portland would be leading the charge in this national debate. Dr. Ethan Johnson is the chair and associate professor for the Black Studies Department at Portland State University, and he joins us live this morning to dig into that question. Good morning.
Morning.
Thank you so much for joining us. I know we just saw night 75 last night, 75 days straight of these protests in the city of Portland. So why has this city really become a hub for the Black Lives Matter movement?
You know, it's a good question. I think, what I point to is that Oregon and Portland are also places of intense anti-Black racism. So if we look at social economic indicators, and almost across the board, what we'll see is that Black people suffer disproportionately and also at higher levels than the national averages. So I think that what we're seeing is a response to what Black people are experiencing across the country, but also what we're seeing here in Portland is a very, I would argue, sometimes a more intense experience and suffering of anti-Blackness.
It is so interesting because, you go on Google and you search whitest city. Portland shows up. We do have a lot of liberal white people too, but then there is this racism that people have experienced. So what is motivating people here, maybe more so than other cities, to go out and protest night after night, and people of all races?
Well, I'm not sure, if there's like more motivation here. I know that across the country, people are still protesting, and I think Oregon is getting a lot of attention for that. And when I've gone myself out to the protests, more than once, and you do see it is a majority white group of people that are out there. And I think, what I would connect it to is that while, I think what I would connect it to is that Portland also has this idea of itself as being a really progressive place. And I would also connect it to that both historically and contemporarily, white people in the state have also been resisting other forms of inequality also. And one of the examples that I like to give is that when I first got here in 2005, I started teaching a racism class, and there was a young white woman in the class. And she was part of a skinhead group that was going out and confronting white skinheads who were attacking Black people and other people of color. So, I point to that to just also indicate that there is a history here of white people resisting racism and other forms of inequality. But that doesn't necessarily speak to why, kind of white people are the dominant group outside of these protests. And, I think some of the questions that people have that maybe they're distracting away from what is the real reason why people are out there.
Do you think there are other motivations outside of just the Black Lives Matter movement that is bringing a lot of these people out there?
Well, so one of the things that I point out in my class, right, is that, and you've already pointed this out, this is a primarily white state and a primarily white city. And one of the things that I noticed is when I started just traveling through the state, and I've been, all over it, in the east, near the border with Idaho and on either sides, is that you see also a lot of poor white people in the state. And actually, I've never seen so many poor white people. Now, I'm not trying to say, that's the reason why all those white people are out there. But there is a lot of inequality in the state in general. So that might be a reason for understanding why so many white people are out there. And one of the things that I came across in my research that I think is really interesting is that where Black people experience some of the most intense forms of anti-Blackness is also where white people are also experiencing intense forms of inequality. So there might be some relation there.
So a form of not empathy, but sympathy, you know, kind of
Right.
an understanding that might be motivating people in some cases. You know, the other thing we've seen play out is this kind of dichotomy of most of the protests being overwhelmingly peaceful and these smaller groups of demonstrators out in the suburbs as well. But then we have this small group in Portland, with the exception of last night, you know, that has been violent many nights. What kind of connotation is that having on the movement as a whole, especially with that being on the national stage?
Yeah, I think I really try to push away from focusing on the violence of the protesters. First of all, I think it's usually individual and small and doesn't represent the whole uh, group of people out there. But I also think that we have to contextualize it within just what is violence. We live in a deeply violent society, and that's very easy to point out. And I also think it's important for listeners to think about violence wider than just physical violence. There's all types of violence that people experience. And I think that to kind of focus on some people who may be damaging some property when we live in, arguably, one of the most violent places probably in the world in terms of, if you were to think of, our military, what our police do, and just the experiences of Indigenous and Black people in this country historically and in the present. So I think it's important that we think about violence in a different way.
Okay. Well, Dr. Ethan Johnson, thank you so much for joining us and shedding some light into this, because it does seem like Portland is being talked about really around the world right now. So important time. Thank you for your time.
You're welcome. Thank you.